Could you introduce yourself to us? Tell us your name and your religion and where you're from.
Sure. My name is Rabbi Bina Wing. I am a rabbi for the Jewish community here in Rockford. I've been in Rockford since the summer of 2002. The temple where I work, called Temple Bethel, practices Reform Judaism, and I'm a rabbi in the Reform tradition.
All right, good. So could you describe the heart of the Jewish faith for us? What is the meaning of life for a Jew?
I would say at the heart of the Jewish faith is the idea that we are partners with God, that we have a covenant with God to improve the world. And so we do that through the pursuit of justice. So the pursuit of justice is really, I think, at the heart of what Jewish practice is all about, making the world better for everybody who's in it. Judaism is very focused on the world that we live in now. And so the actions that Jews are instructed to take have to do with making the world better now for the people who are in it. And we tend to focus, and partially this is biblical, on those who are less fortunate. The language of the Bible, talks about the poor and the widow and the orphan and the homeless and that kind of thing. And that's very much our focus as well. So Jews tend to be pretty social justice oriented in what our causes are. And it's interesting, sometimes people speak about a term called tzedakah, and sometimes it's translated as charity, but it really comes from the Hebrew root, meaning justice. And so we're instructed to give money. Charity, the sense of charity is like, well, if I have a little extra, I'll give it to charity. I'll give it away. From the Jewish perspective, tzedakah is an obligation. So you do it whether you feel like doing it or not, whether it makes you feel good about it or not. I mean, we hope that you'll feel good about it, but you give it because it's an obligation. So there's an expression in Judaism, al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. Upon three things the world exists: Torah, avodah, and gimilut chasadim. So Torah refers to like Torah, but not just but study and learning and advancement and that kind of thing. Avodah translates as service or worship, and so that's part of it. And gimilut chasadim is deeds of loving kindness. And so the combination of those three things. And some people also say that that the 3 points are God, Torah, and Israel. So God, meaning obviously God, Torah meaning study and everything the Torah stands for, which includes justice, and then Israel meaning the people of Israel, like supporting, and not the state of Israel necessarily, but the people, the Jewish people as a whole. And so the combination of all of that is really at the heart of who we are.
Good. Is there anything you would like to say about the different branches of Judaism?
Sure. So before I get into that, I probably should tell you a little bit about Jewish law and how Jewish law develops. So Jewish law, well, at the heart of Judaism is the Torah. And the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And everything about Judaism is loosely based on what those 5 books say. Now, what's important to note is that if you read through the 5 books, you wouldn't really know that much about Judaism. You'd know maybe a little bit about what the holidays are, and you'd know a little bit about random things. But you'd understand more what Jewish tradition was like perhaps 2,000 years ago, or even further back than that. because there's some very, very old stories and old parts of the Torah. But you wouldn't really understand how Judaism developed, because Judaism at its heart is about rabbinic interpretation. So the rabbis of old are scholars and teachers. They took the Torah text and said, what is this trying to teach us? What is it trying to tell us? And so they created, and this is sort of an abbreviated version of this, but they took conversations that had been had over the generations of rabbis and put it into books called the Talmud. And then on top of the Talmud, there was interpretive books as well, codes of law that come out of this, and then commentary on the codes of law, and then someone else has an opinion about a different code, and so they want to create their own code of law, and then there's commentary on that. It isn't that things differ radically. It isn't like one person says it's fine to eat bacon and the other person says it's not. But there's differences throughout the generations, because Judaism continues to change and develop. It's a living faith. So it continues to change and develop wherever people have lived. Anyway, so you have these laws set forth about how a person is supposed to live, how a person is supposed to, how a Jewish person is supposed to live their life. This is called the halakha, which literally means the way to walk. How you interpret halakha depends on what denomination of Judaism you are. So in what's called Orthodox Judaism, they believe that all of Jewish law, everything that's written in the Torah, plus all the rabbinic interpretations, are divine in origin, meaning they come from God. So everything, every little bit of Jewish law has to be followed. And this is whether you agree with it, whether it has meaning for you. The meaning comes from doing it. So you just follow the law very strictly. Reform Judaism, on the other end of the spectrum, takes some of the ethical laws, and those are binding on everyone, but takes some of the ritual laws, like some of the dietary laws about things you can and can't eat, ritual laws about, there's even ritual laws about how men should cut their hair or not cut their hair, what clothing you should wear, what your practices should be on the Sabbath, what you should and shouldn't do on the Sabbath. And Reform Judaism takes some of those ritual laws and makes it more of a personal preference. So you can have a Reformed Jew who's quite observant of the law, who finds a lot of meaning in it, and they follow the law very closely because it's spiritually fulfilling for them to do that, and they feel connected to tradition and so forth. But you can also have a Reformed Jew that's not very observant at all, that doesn't keep the dietary laws and doesn't even come to synagogue all that often, and yet they still consider themselves Jewish, and they still follow Jewish ethical teachings. So, and then somewhere in the middle is what we would call conservative Judaism, which tries to balance the strictness of Orthodox Judaism with the modernity of Reform Judaism. What's important is that from the Reform perspective, on some level we believe that a person picks and chooses what is meaningful to them. But the truth of the matter is that happens even in Orthodox Judaism. Even within Orthodox Judaism, there's a wide variety of observance. So you could have an Orthodox Jew who won't eat any food outside of their own home because they're worried about the dietary laws. And then you can have someone who's within Orthodox Judaism who, while they're certainly not going to eat the things that are really forbidden in Judaism, would still eat a meal at a friend's house or even at a non-Jewish person's house, as long as it was something like something with vegetables or something like that. So there's some picking and choosing that happens even within the Orthodox tradition. But I suppose that the main difference has to do with the nature, how we view the binding nature of the law, whereas Orthodox finds it very binding, and Reform Judaism takes the Jewish law into account, but it's much more personal preference what we choose to do with it.
Good. Could you tell us a little bit about how interpretation occurs within Judaism?
Well, there is a process of interpretation that happens. It usually it happens through the level of the rabbis. So interpretation of Jewish law has been going on really since 2,000 years ago, when rabbis were trying to figure out what the text was telling them. And even in modern times, interpretation of Jewish law happens through the rabbis. And people can sort of submit questions that they're curious about, and then rabbis will sort of study the ancient texts that have come before, or even the medieval texts, and try and come up with a modern answer to a particular question or problem. So.
All right, good. How does one become a Jew? Are you born into it? Is there a conversion process? Tell us a little bit about how one becomes a Jew.
So one can definitely convert to Judaism, and in some ways that kind of begs a different question. So before we get into that, Judaism is so much more than just a religion. So it's a religion, and it's a culture, and it's an ethnic group, and it has a lot of different qualities of a lot of different things. It's a way of life, really, in its entirety. But the one thing that it's not is a race, and this is sometimes something that gets misinterpreted. And the reason that it's not a race is because you can convert to Judaism when you can't convert your race. So that's the one thing we know Judaism is not, is a race, because you can convert. So what is the process of conversion? It's a combination of a couple of different things. It's both study and becoming a part of the Jewish community. Converting to Judaism, I use the analogy of adoption a lot when I'm talking about the process of conversion, because you can adopt a child into your home and you can love that child right from the start, but it takes a while before the child knows that Wednesday night the family always goes out for spaghetti dinner, and that the knives are kept in the third drawer from the left to keep the little baby from opening it up. So it's little things like that. So you can learn a lot about Judaism by reading books and by studying, but part of the process of converting to Judaism is becoming part of the people and part of the culture, and that takes time. It usually takes about a year, sometimes longer, for someone to convert to Judaism, because they really need to experience the entire year of Jewish holidays and the cycle of life that's part of the Jewish calendar. And so you really need to experience all of that before you can totally complete the process. So it's a combination of book learning and studying and reading, and experiential, putting things into practice, beginning to incorporate Jewish practices into your life, whether that's in your home or through worship.
Okay. Could you describe a typical week in the life of a Jewish practitioner?
I don't know that there is one particular way of life for all Jews. Even within a particular denomination in Judaism, there isn't one particular way to live a Jewish life. For most Jews, the focus of the week is on the Sabbath, which for us begins Friday night and goes through Saturday night. So Saturday, mostly during the day, is our holy day, but it begins on Friday evening. We call that day Shabbat, which is Sabbath in Hebrew. And for Jewish people, that's the most important day of the week. So it's the day of rest, it's the day of holiness, it's the day of joy and peacefulness. And so these are all aspects that are part of the Jewish week. I mean, is leading up to that day. Within the week itself, it depends on your denomination. So someone who's not necessarily your denomination, but how observant you are of Jewish law. So someone who's very observant of Jewish law will offer prayers 2 or 3 times a day. So they will they'll go to their synagogue, their local synagogue, and they will pray 2 or 3 times a day. You can pray individually, but it's better to pray with a group. And that's part of the ritual. And then someone also who's very observant will say a blessing before they eat and say another blessing after they eat. And really, the person who's very observant, they have blessings throughout the day that they'll say. So there's a prayer that you say, you ritually wash your hands before you eat. There's a prayer to say when you use the restroom. There's lots of different prayers that a person would say throughout the day. But on average, then when they're not doing those things, they're doing the things everybody else does, going to work and going to school and that sort of thing. But Shabbat is really the special day, and again, there too, everybody approaches it differently, but usually for Jewish people, there is some marking of the day, whether it's, you light candles in your home on Friday night to mark the beginning of Shabbat. Some people go to temple. Some people make a point to take a rest on Saturday. Someone who's very traditional will make sure to incorporate worship in the synagogue as part of the Sabbath day. And I would say that on average is, a typical week in terms of practice.
Good.
Jews are very action-oriented. Judaism is much more about what you do than what you believe. And in some ways, God is almost kind of secondary to Jewish practice. So you can have somebody who says, oh, I'm a very devout Jew, but if they behave badly, then we don't think of that person as being a good Jew. And the opposite can be true. You can have someone who does great work for the world and great work for the community, but isn't quite sure what they believe about God, and we might say that that person's still a good Jew. We're very, very action-oriented. So by a long shot, it's what you do over what you believe in Judaism.
Would you like to distinguish between a synagogue